Okay, hello everybody. We are Paola and Gabriela from SC English. Today we have a guest interviewer, 𝚑𝚘𝚛𝚎𝚔, who is a teacher and a teacher educator at the Teachers Training College Instituto Superior de Formación Docente y Técnica 60 in General Viamonte. Belén was our student here at the local Teachers Training College in Junín, and now she's our colleague, so we are very happy to have her here with us today. And we are also very eager to talk to Marek, who is our special guest, and who I'm going to be introducing right now. Marek Kiczkowiak, originally from Poland, is a teacher and a teacher trainer. He holds a BA in English, 𝚘𝚘, 𝙿𝚘, and a PhD in 𝚘𝚎. He has been teaching English abroad since 2010 and currently works in Belgium. He's also the founder of TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy and the author of the book Teaching English as a Lingua Franca, The Journey from EFL to ELF, which is an authoritative analysis of why and how English is used as an international language and an argument for teaching it differently. He has also written numerous articles for ELT magazines and newsletters. Marek frequently presents at international conferences and gives teacher training sessions, both face-to-face and online, focusing on English as a lingua franca and native speakerism. So thank you very much, Marek, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It seems like I do a lot of different things.
Well, you do.
Well, you do. You do. Okay, to start with our questions. We know that your main area of interest is English as a lingua franca, and you have working really hard to tackle native speakerism, and you have made this your own personal crusade. And well, you even founded the TEFL Equity Academy, as Paul said before. How did you become interested in this area, and what pushed you to found your own academy?
So I think as many people who don't speak English as a first language and who teach it, I've obviously come across native speakerism very quickly when I started applying for jobs abroad. At the beginning, I was probably, very young and innocent, and I didn't really understand that. I didn't expect to be discriminated against or treated differently because my first language is Polish. But obviously I was, and this, when it happened for the first time, I kind of felt that there wasn't any information for me available, what I should do in this situation, how I should tackle it, how should I react to it. There had obviously been a lot written about it in academic journals, but I didn't know about it to start with. But there seemed to be very few kind of blogs. There were here, I encountered a few blog posts here and there, but there was very little kind of advice on, what I should do. And I kind of felt a little bit lonely, so that kind of pushed me to first to write an article for 𝚑𝚘𝚑𝚑 about it, and then to start a blog, which eventually developed into a whole website and now online courses. But it all kind of started, I think, as many things in life, it all started kind of by accident, I suppose. I never planned to have a website and online courses like I do now, and to give webinars and things like that. It just kind of happened step by step.
Very interesting what you have done. So Marek, let's talk first about native speakerism. You mentioned your experience, and can you define it and tell us how it affects the ELT world in general?
Sure. So I think it's a very good point to start with, because perhaps some of our listeners are not familiar with the term. So you can think of native speakerism as an ideology that is basically based on someone's perceived belonging to the native speaker group. And I say perceived because not everybody will be perceived as a native speaker. So there's a lot of research that shows that being a native speaker is frequently associated with Western looking and white people. And on the other hand, if I went to certain countries, I might be treated as a native speaker because I'm a white, fairly privileged male, and I might be treated as a native speaker as well. And you can think of it as similar to kind of sexism or racism, the other negative ideologies, with the main difference being that unlike sexism, which is based on someone's perceived belonging to a gender group and all the stereotypes that we associate with that gender, the same thing happens with native speakerism, but it's your perceived first language, your perceived belonging to the native speaker group. And it's in terms of what effects it has, obviously the most visible one is the effect on job ads, where many recruiters will hire only native speakers, regardless of how highly or how lowly qualified they are. The main request is that they are native speakers or that they come from a specific country. So that's perhaps the effect that people are most familiar with. But as any ideology, it's basically perpetuated and maintained through what is called discourses, or you can think of it as beliefs, what seem like common sense beliefs. And these are further perpetuated and maintained in social practices or things that we do, which again, on the surface seem very common sense and are believed to be right by a lot of people, but they just further perpetuate these ideas. So to give you one example, one of these native speakerist discourses is the idea that native speaker pronunciation, and again, when I say native speaker, I mean the so-called perceived native speaker, which in here, in terms of pronunciation, means someone who speaks with a standard British or general American accent, right? That this native speaker pronunciation is the default pronunciation that all our students and teachers should aim for, right? And this is obviously visible in social practices or things that we do, right? That we, this is the pronunciation that materials writers will include in the course books. This is what many trainees are told on teacher training courses. This is what, as teachers, we want our students to, the pronunciation we want our students to imitate, and so on.
Right, and another, well, many teachers are now familiar with the term native speakerism, not as familiar as, well, I mean, it's a good idea that you described it, or you told us what it meant, because many of us might not yet be familiar with it. And another term that we now hear a lot is world Englishes, right? So can you tell us what we understand by world Englishes? And we also know that you are somehow critical of it. So can you tell us what we understand by world Englishes and what the potential problems, what its potential problems can be?
Sure. So the theory or the research about world Englishes has been around for a very long time. It was probably one of the first research kind of fields that attempted to question this idea that, you know, some Englishes, those spoken in Britain or in the US, are better than other Englishes. And one of the key figures here is 𝚑𝚘𝚔, for example, right? So world English is basically focused on legitimizing the so-called post-colonial Englishes, or the Englishes that are spoken in former British colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean, in places like India, in Southeast Asia. So a lot of that research focused on displacing kind of standard British or general American English as the only correct English, as the only standard English. And it, by extension, it focused on kind of establishing their own standards, so standard Indian English, and it focused on describing, for example, Indian or Kenyan English as legitimate varieties of English. So in many ways, it helped kind of, I think, change a little bit this perspective that those post-colonial Englishes are somehow worse, that they are inferior, they are not on the same level as, say, British or American English. And a lot of people have also found faults with this approach, or have criticized it in different ways. one perhaps important criticism is that in a way it was established to challenge the standard British or American, the hegemony of these standard Englishes. But in order to do so, it had to establish its own standards of Indian English or Kenyan English, for example, which of course not all Indian users of English will have. So in one way, it wanted to challenge standards, but it had to impose its own standards, if you see what I mean. So that's, for example, one criticism that many researchers have had against it. But I think it's been an incredibly powerful idea that has, I think, completely changed how a lot of scholars think about what is the English language and where it's spoken and which varieties are valid and so on.
Okay, there has been some advance and a lot has been said and written about native speakerism, okay? And why do you think that still today in the 21st century, native speakerism perpetuates, and which are possible ways of tackling it, and maybe from a, as you mentioned, a top-down approach?
So I think the answer to it is very simple. I mean, if we compare it to sexism or racism, I mean, the fight against sexism has been going on for at least 100 years, if we only take it back to the suffragette movement for voting rights, right? Even if we just take it back 100 years, we're still not much closer to equality between men and women in many countries, unfortunately. And the same thing happens with racism, even though, you know, it has been going on for such a long time. We've had legislation and you know, and powerful people speaking out against it. You know, we've all seen what happens in countries like the US or even here in Belgium where I live. So, you know, native speakerism, the sort of the fight against native speakerism, even the conception of something as native speakerism, that it exists and it's a problem, it's such a recent thing. I mean, it was only first described by Adrian Holiday in his book, The Struggle to Teach English as an International Language, in only 15 years ago, right? So, you know, if we compare it, I mean, we might, some of our ancestors will be probably sitting here 100 years from now, and probably, unfortunately, they might be still talking about the same issues. Hopefully, as with sexism, maybe it will happen in fewer countries to a lesser degree, but I don't think native speakerism will disappear anytime soon, unfortunately, right? But there are a lot of things that we can do. You mentioned sort of top-down approaches. These are perhaps a little bit more difficult because, you know, they involve people in more powerful positions who have to act against native speakerism. But such actions have already been taken by, for example, teaching association. Many teaching associations, starting with TEFL International already over 20 years ago, issued statements, open letters against native speakerism or discrimination of non-native speakers based on the first language, right? And other associations, TEFL Spain, TEFL France, have also issued similar statements. And I think it would be really good if more teaching associations really supported this fight for equality, because, you know, even though you might say that, well, it's just a written letter of support that doesn't change anything, I think at least it does show your position, and something such as neutrality does not exist. If you're neutral, you support the powerful, the one in power, you support the oppressor, right? So I think it's really important for teaching associations to really openly come out and say, like, look, this is wrong and we should do this and that. And I think what should follow on from this is that they should establish, you know, let's call them help centers for a lack of better word, but maybe places or mechanisms that non-native speakers who see these job ads or who get discriminated against can use to try and fight this. Because again, teaching associations might say that, well, it's not my job to fight for workers' rights. But if it's not your job, then whose job is it, I think, right? And the problem is that many of us who work in the private sector cannot join unions. Unions are for teachers in the state sector, right? So what do I do if a language school in Spain doesn't hire me because I'm Polish? Who do I go to? And I think it should be a teaching association that somehow, if they can't help with the legal work, maybe they can direct you in the right direction. Maybe they can have lawyers that they work with that you can contact, right? In order to try and solve this problem. So I think, you know, this is one example of what could be done from the top down.
Well, very, very interesting, and we will keep working on that. Listen, I would like to ask you about teaching English as a lingua franca. Can you tell us and our audience what ELF, or English as a lingua franca, is?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. You can see English as a lingua franca simply as a way in which English is currently used. That means in its majority by people who don't use it as the first language. English is typically used in multilingual contexts in order for people to communicate. Is basically the language that people choose to communicate because no other language is available or appropriate in this case. And I also like to think about it, and this is what we said as well with Robert Lowe in our book, Teaching English as a Lingua Franca, is that you can think of it as a paradigm, perhaps, that is different from EFL, English as a foreign language, and ESL, English as a second language, that is based on different assumptions, let's say, or beliefs about the English language and teaching it, right? And it's perhaps worth mentioning as well what English as a lingua franca is not, because there are a lot of myths about it. So for example, English as a lingua franca is not a variety of the language, right? So unlike, for example, the research on world Englishes that we've been talking about, English as a lingua franca is not like, say, Indian English. So no ELF researchers want to establish a variety of English, right? It's just a variable, changeable way of using the language, but it's never going to be a variety.
Okay, yeah. And one issue of relevance when we talk about English as a lingua franca is the issue of intelligibility, right? That concerns, that worries many teachers somehow. So can you tell us what we understand by intelligibility and where we can draw the line as teachers or as users of the language between what is intelligible and what is not? Maybe not just in terms of pronunciation, but grammar and lexis as well?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and in research then they distinguish between intelligibility, comprehensibility, and interpretability. But maybe for this discussion, we'll just keep it sort of simple. So if there are researchers out there, please bear with me, and apologies for the simplification. But I think you can, in terms of pronunciation, you can think of intelligibility as basically being understood, right, and being easy to understand. Now, of course, this can also be influenced, and there's a lot of research showing this, that this can also be influenced by other factors. It's not just about your voice. So, for example, certain faces give certain associations, and if you are not Western looking or not white, you might be perceived as less intelligible, or you might be perceived as more difficult to understand, not because your pronunciation is any different, but because people have some immediate associations with it, right? But in terms of pronunciation, if we take the view that intelligibility is being easy to understand, then a lot of research has been done on it, identifying features of pronunciation that are really important for clear voice, for clear pronunciation. There's a lot of listeners might be probably familiar with Jennifer Jenkins, whose research was the first one to try and empirically establish which pronunciation features are important. I mean, she didn't even set out to do this. She was just interested in how her students she was teaching in England, and she was teaching multilingual classes, and she was interested in the question, how come my students communicate with each other and have interesting conversations, and are intelligible to each other, even though none of them really follows the British pronunciation that I'm trying to teach them, right? And what she managed to establish was that there are certain pronunciation features that are really important for intelligibility. So if you mispronounce these features, it's likely that you will be misunderstood in international context, right? So we have this research, and I think as a teacher, you can use it to establish priorities in the classroom. So the features that are important for intelligibility are, for example, consonants, consonant clusters, so groups of consonants. Then we also have vowel length, not the quality of the vowel, but how long it is. And then we have nuclear stress, so the most important stress in a given short utterance, which shouldn't be confused with sentence stress, what's often presented in course books, which is kind of all the stressed syllables in a sentence. And here we're talking about the most stressed syllable. So in here, the nuclear stress was on most, right? And I think, so that's one way of establishing, for example, what's intelligible and what's to focus on. So if I was to give you as a teacher practical advice what to do with pronunciation, I would say that first you need to make sure that your students are able to pronounce these pronunciation features that I've just mentioned, which are often referred to as lingua franca core. And that's something that if you Google, you'll definitely find lists of those sounds. And I think this should be the priority in the classroom. Then if you have more time, I'm not saying you should not focus on vowel quality, for example, or sentence stress. You can if you want to, but this should be, in my opinion, secondary. You can think of it similarly to vocabulary, right? When you teach vocabulary, I'm sure you want to teach the most useful words for your students, the ones that they're going to use immediately. You know, so if you're teaching business English, you're going to teach them business language, not, you know, I don't know, medical English, right? And it's the same here. We want to teach our students the pronunciation that they really need in order to be easy to understand as soon as possible. And another way to think about, you know, intelligibility as a teacher is to sort of, it's a bit more difficult because you have to take a step back and think, okay, I can understand what the student is saying, but would other people from other countries understand that, right? So especially if you share the first language with your students, this might be a little bit tricky because you might be able to understand them, but would a person from Poland or from China also understand them? Why or why not, right? And there are no clear answers here in terms of vocabulary or grammar, sort of, you know, what is intelligible and what isn't, because it really depends on the context. If you have, say, you know, an Argentinian and a French user of English speaking together, even if they throw in a lot of words from the first languages, the communication is likely to flow because they share, French and Spanish share common roots, right? So a lot of vocabulary will be similar, but that might be very different if they're talking to a Vietnamese user of English, for example, right? So it does depend a lot on the context. So to kind of try and take a step back and think, okay, how understandable this is going to be to different users of English from different countries, and definitely get away from the idea of would a native speaker understand it? That's a wrong way to think about it because, you know, your students aren't necessarily learning English to communicate with native speakers. They're learning it to communicate with people from all around the world. And perhaps one last thing to think about it if we're thinking about vocabulary is also to try and get away from the idea that the more native-like someone's English, the better. This isn't necessarily true. I mean, even if we just take anecdotal evidence, 99% of students will tell you that native speakers are incredibly difficult to understand. And there is a good reason for it. You know, there's the pronunciation, for example, connected speech very often makes you more difficult to understand, right? Not less difficult. And there is a lot of vocabulary that very proficient users of English might use, but it might be confusing for other people in international context. So it's, for say, idioms, especially idioms that are very culturally bound, like something, I don't know, the ball is in your court, or the world is your oyster, or, you know, things like this that, you know, you might want to teach at, you know, C1 or C2 level, But I think if you do, you need to let your students know that look, if you're using these, you might need to, for example, paraphrase or use other communicative strategies to make the meaning clear of your expression. And on the other hand, there is nothing wrong about your students, for example, translating idioms from their own language or using their first language when communicating, as long as, you know, they make the meaning clear. So very often, you know, you might hear people in ELF context say things like, well, in my country, we say this, and it basically means blah, blah, blah. And then another person will go, oh, that's a really interesting expression. In my country, we would say this, you know, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's no worse or better than a native speaker saying the ball is in your court. It's exactly the same. The person is just using the cultural and linguistic resources that they have to communicate in English. The problem starts when the other person cannot understand and the person who speaks doesn't paraphrase, doesn't communicate clearly, doesn't explain.
Exactly. So interesting what you're saying, especially because sometimes we hear teachers who are afraid of this new paradigm, as you said, of ELF. Well, but that's not English. We are not teaching English. Okay, so it's great that you mentioned, especially those 4 features. Okay, that you mentioned at the beginning. Okay, to go on.
And just to interrupt,
yes.
just to what's just something that came to my mind when you said it. I mean, if as a teacher you think that, okay, but you know, if somebody says like, wow, Messi scored an absolute golazo, right? It was a really beautiful goal. It was a golazo. If you think that this is not English, somebody is translating from Spanish, well, the same thing happened when English went to the States, right? And then it just adopted lots of words from indigenous languages. And then when it went to Australia, it adopted even more words. And many words that you think are English words, they come from French anyway. So, you know, it's just a natural process. I know that it, you know, when it happens in this moment, it feels strange, but it's what always happens when language evolves and different people from different cultures start using it.
Okay, our next question has to do with materials. Okay, we usually ask the experts we interview about materials because more and more teachers are now creating their own material or adapting pre-existing material, right? So can you give us some tips that we can consider or take into account at the moment of creating or adapting this material for an ELF use?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking a lot, for example, about pronunciation, and we mentioned the lingua franca core or the features of pronunciation that are important for intelligibility. So I think as a teacher, the first step, if you're using a course book, would be to go through the course book to see if the pronunciation taught is actually lingua franca core and how much of it is, and then adapt it accordingly. If you realize that, I don't know, 70% of your course book is just connected speech and intonation, then I think as a teacher, you need to come in and start changing it and start introducing more pronunciation features that are important for intelligibility. You can still do those other features if you want to, later if you have time, right? Another simple idea would be to include more non-native speaker accents in your classes, especially those that your students are likely to hear. So I imagine that, you know, students in, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe students in Argentina will interact a lot with Brazilian speakers, or maybe with other speakers from South America, and then other speakers from around the world, right? But you could interview your students, ask them, you know, who do you use English with often? If they don't know, then you could choose some recordings using your own knowledge and experience, and then introduce these to your classes. So again, if your materials have a lot of British English or American English, if you just stick to that, I think you're doing your students a disservice, because then they'll come out of your classes and then they'll speak to somebody from Brazil and then they'll go like, but I don't really understand what they're saying, right? Because we haven't helped them understand them. So I think this is really, really important as well. You could also introduce awareness raising activities. So you could discuss a lot of issues related to English as a lingua franca or native speakerism with your students. For example, you could give them a job ad that says native speakers only, and ask your students to talk about it. You could ask your students to talk about the qualities of a good language teacher and why. You could ask them to write a job ad. There are many different things that you could do with it. And this being a controversial topic, it rarely gets included in classes, but any controversial topic generates a lot of discussion because people will disagree. You will get some students who will say, no, only British accent is good. And then other students will say, no, I think it's nice when you sound Italian or French or whatever. And then they will discuss, right? And you don't even have to impose any ideas on them. You can, you know, they can just discuss it themselves and come at the end to some conclusions.
There. Okay, well, I think we have covered many of the things we wanted to ask you, and we want to say thank you very much again for accepting our invitation. We have learned a lot from you, and we were here listening attentively to you. So thank you very much, Marek, for having accepted our invitation.
No, thank you very much for having me. I really
It's
enjoyed the
been
conversation.
very interesting, and as Pau said, we've been listening and learning. Would you like to share your website with yes, with our viewers, with our audience?
Sure, thank you.
And tell them what they can find there.
So if you want more information about teaching English as a lingua franca or native speakerism, then you can visit 𝚃𝚎𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑 about English as a lingua franca and native speakerism. And importantly, perhaps for a lot of teachers, you'll find lesson plans as well and teaching ideas. And there is also an academy where we dive deeper into these issues, and there are courses about English as a lingua franca and native speakerism.
Good.
Yes, and we can follow you on Facebook and Instagram as well, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.